David Pakman, David Pakman, David Pakman. It's high noon somewhere. Alright, so, hello boys and girls and those who like to bounce in between. It's Stanky Kang here. And today the subject of our video is going to be old David Pakman once again. I am a former fan of old David Pakman, and to some extent, I still am. I still like David Pakman. Not as much as I used to, not nearly as much, ladies and gents. And I criticized him in past videos for basically, he threw Ilhan Omar under the bus. It was a real chode move on his part. Real not smart move. It kind of came out of left field for me. He also had some pretty bad criticisms of AOC, and then, to make matters worse, he had this fucking Nazi goober Richard Spencer on his show, and he gave him a very softball interview where he wasn't really grilling him at all. And maybe that's just how David is. He's not the kind of person to have you on a show and just completely just roast your ass for his audience, but to that I say, well, then maybe you shouldn't have people on your show if they're gonna be Nazis and you're not gonna like antagonize them. I don't see the point in having a Nazi on your show. I don't give a flying fuck about their stupid little beliefs and stupid little worldview, and I don't care about hearing about it. I know about all that shit already, and it's stupid. It's just a bunch of great replacement Pepe bullshit. But anyway, David Pakman gave him a real nice review, was a real cool guy to him. So, yeah, I've got some mixed emotions about David Pakman. It's high noon. It's time to get, it's time for him to take his horse down the Old Town Road and ride till he can't anymore. Because we're going to get into this video here where he says why I'm not a socialist.
So last week we talked about democratic socialism versus social democracy, and I talked to you about how, especially since Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's win in New York, there has been sort of more and more confusion as to what is democratic socialism versus what is social democracy. And I did a story explaining the difference. Democratic socialism is actually socialism, wants to remove capitalism and replace it with socialized ownership of the means of production, at least originally, although now there are people who say, well, they're still democratic socialists, but they don't actually want that, which makes me question whether they're actually democratic socialists at this point. And
I think the confusion arises because Bernie Sanders insists on calling himself, and the other progressives insist on calling themselves democratic socialists instead of social democrats. And I think their reason for doing this is amicable because they want to sort of rebrand socialism in American politics and make it not such a boogeyman anymore. And so with that I can respect it. But in the fact that they're being revisionist chuds about it, and they're trying to change the word socialism just to mean a mild social democracy, that's pretty darn low. That's a low, dirty blow. And leave it to the Sockadems to always do shit like that. To package their little quote unquote revolution in a very neat little bow that looks really nice, but once you unwrap the present, you discover, hey, this isn't real social change. We're still under the yoke of the bourgeoisie here.
then on the other hand, we talked about social democracy, which is a progressive movement that wants to work within a market economy, within capitalism, and make it more of what I call
Boo.
a socially guided market economy. And the difference is massive, and the confusion between these two systems is very, very problematic. And
I will give it to David though. He knows at least he knows the difference. And I wish more people were like him. I wish more people out there knew the difference between their leftist ideologies, because to them, like, to most people in the US, if you're a liberal, then you're just left. Everybody left is a liberal, and everybody liberal is left, and that's just bullshit. Uh, liberals are centrists at the very least, or usually right wing. Uh, but in terms of being left wing, people don't know the difference between a democratic socialist and a social democrat, or a Trotskyist and a Leninist, or a Maoist and a anarchist. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there, a whole bunch of different ideas out there as to how the revolution should go. And some people want to sell out and be capitalist bootlickers like David Pakman, and other people want an actual true blue revolution that will instill a dictatorship of the proletariat, which isn't a bad thing, ladies and gentlemen. It's a good thing. You want one of those.
Top response that I got from people in the audience was, I mean, of course, other than trolling, was, what's your position, David? And I've mentioned before that I'm not a socialist. I'm a social democrat in the sort of Nordic or Swedish tradition. And today I'm going to explain to you why I am not a socialist. And I'm happy to do this. It's something that's been an area of study for me since undergraduate and even including in graduate school. And I'm going to start sort of at the end, and then we'll walk through it. Fundamentally, I'm not a socialist because I want
All right,
an
here we go.
egalitarian, free, self-determining society. And that type of
Okay.
society will not emerge from authoritarian apparatus.
All right, so he wants an egalitarian. What was it again?
An
Egalitarian.
egalitarian, free, self-determining society.
All right, so to that I say, how in the hell are the proletariats self-determined? How are they free in the current paradigm under capitalism? Even a capitalism with a neat little bow around it like social democracy, how is that going to help their plight? How's that going to help the fundamental difference between the power dynamic of their boss and themselves as the working class? How's that going to affect issues that inevitably come up when the capitalist market crashes? The working class go without their much needed social programs. You create a class that's entirely dependent on the capitalist government to ensure that they survive. And part of that is because they have to keep doing imperialism abroad to make money to support this vast welfare state that they have created under capitalism. Instead of the superabundance that socialism gives and the use-based economy that it provides, instead everything's sold as a commodity on the free market. And all the problems inherent in capitalism are still there, David Pakman. You don't really solve anything. Yeah, poor people can get some health care, and they might be able to get some free college tuition, but the dynamic of the capitalist system, the oppression still remains. The class struggle still remains. You've just strengthened the working class, but you haven't empowered them. You haven't given them the keys to the kingdom, David.
And that type of society will not emerge from authoritarian apparatus. And what
I would argue that the average worker, consider the Soviet Union. Before the revolution, did the average peasant have that much autonomy in how the trajectory of their life could go? But I mean, after the Soviet Union, they had access to education. And from that, the possibilities became not limitless, certainly limited, but a lot more. Their prospects in life became a lot more. It took people from essentially a pre-industrial, almost a medieval level society and brought them up into the modern age in a single generation. You're going to tell me that didn't give some people some freedom? That didn't give some people some difference to determine their own path in life? That's a bunch of hogwash, David.
that means is that at the national
Socialism is ultimately the liberator of the working class. Democratic social democracy, on the other hand, wants to keep them in their chains.
level, socialist and communist structures are fundamentally authoritarian. And at scale, enacting social
It's only authoritarian from the view of the bourgeoisie because it's a dictatorship of the proletariat. I mean, you could argue in the exact same fashion the capitalist system is authoritarian towards the proletariat. So, we have a current dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in this country, in the United States. David wants to keep it that way. but he wants to give a little crumbs to the poor folks so they stop complaining as much. But he ultimately doesn't want to solve the real issues.
Socialism or communism becomes authoritarian. And a top example is Venezuela. Let's assume in
Oh, geez, here we go. All right, first of all, Venezuela. Um, let's look at Venezuela's private economy. Because people keep throwing around this meme that Venezuela is this, socialist country, but let's just look here. It's based largely on the petroleum sector and manufacturing. Total trade amounted to 48.1% of the country's GDP. Let's see. Trying to read about this shit because it's important. God damn it. Let's see this Cora sector. This is all just horse shit, ladies and gentlemen. Venezuela is not some fucking authoritarian country. They don't have gulags. Maduro was democratically elected. And all of this sort of social democracy. The fact that the social democrats don't support Venezuela and the Bolivarian government just show their imperialist intentions. They are absolutely horrible on foreign policy. They're just absolutely miserable. And part of the reason why Venezuela has such a horrible economic collapse is because their economy is experiencing this hyperinflation. On 25th August 2017, it was reported that new United States sanctions against Venezuela did not ban trading of the country's existing non-governmental bonds, with the sanctions instead including restrictions intended to block the government's ability to fund itself. So, the sanctions are there for the bankrupting of the government. Combine that with the oil crash that happened a few years ago, and you've got yourself a economy that is not in the best shape. One that's based primarily around petroleum. Now, Nicolas Maduro won the Venezuelan election. They had a higher voter turnout than we did, probably. Let's see. Public opinion. This is some bullshit from the bougie Wall Street Journal. People who go to Venezuela, you'll see everybody likes Maduro. The only people that like Guaido are those shills who like the big oil. Just the really, really hyper rich. So the fact that David Pakman is sort of poo-pooing on the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, which is not authoritarian, very democratic, he's being a bit of a shill.
in good faith that the Chavez Maduro goal was a truly egalitarian, free, thriving society. I don't know if it was, but let's be charitable, right? And they really did want
You
that
better
as the
be
end goal.
charitable.
When you put aside the populist collectivist rhetoric of that regime, the Venezuelan regime is an authoritarian imposition of government without all sorts of freedoms, lacking in press freedom, lacking in judicial freedom. It's a long list, and I'm opposed to it.
Oh yeah, well, name off that list and we could go point by point and I'll explain why those policies are probably vital in the securing of the people's revolution in Venezuela. You ever try to I don't know, establish a socialist democracy somewhere? It's fucking hard. You have every capitalist country all over the place trying to fuck you in the butt and trying to overthrow you and instill some crazy, Pinochet style dictator as president and make everybody's lives miserable for the next 3 decades. So, David Pakman, maybe help them out instead of just
And
throw them under
whatever
the
their
bus.
intentions were, their imposition of those intentions in this authoritarian way has led to absolute disaster. And some socialists.
All right, I'm just gonna get to the bottom of this. Venezuela. I'm typing with one hand. I want to see like how much of Venezuela's companies are actually government run. But this is kind of outdated. But from this website at Reuters, it's showing that the Chavez government seized oil fields that were, essentially owned by these large, Exxon Mobil and stuff. Exxon Mobil probably owned more land in Venezuela than the Venezuelan people did. It essentially became a just a big fucking conundrum over there. Venezuela was just leaking oil out, and none of the profits of that were going back into the country at all. It says Venezuela's economy improved dramatically during much of the Chavez presidency, trending positive until oil price collapsed in 2013. From 1999 through 2013, inflation dropped to its lowest levels in the country since the late 80s, and unemployment dropped drastically, following many years of increases before Chavez was elected. In 99, when Chavez took office, unemployment was at 14.5%. For 2011, it declined to 7.8%, so almost halved. Poverty was decreased significantly, dropping by nearly 50% since the oil strike, with extreme poverty dropping by over 70%. And am I saying that Venezuela's government is perfect? Hell no. And most Venezuelan people will admit that Nicolas Maduro is not Hugo Chavez. You can't really fill his shoes. It's hard to do that, but they are totally against this goober Juan Guaido and his attempts to just sort of just completely open up America to the Western economies like the US and oil companies abroad. And John Bolton, our national security advisor, has said that US ambitions in Venezuela are basically that. So, it's sad to see these social democrats, they're so progressive when it comes to like American politics. They want all these Americans to have health care. They want all these Americans to have free education, but they also deny that same right to Venezuelan people when their government tries to do that, when their government tries to nationalize a few industries. Let's look at the nationalization of these industries because keep in mind, not every industry was nationalized. Venezuela still has a large private sector economy. It's far from being this fucking socialist, land that everybody says it is, all right? The Chavistas, the Bolivarian Revolution, yeah, it's socialist, but that doesn't mean that the whole entire country is moving in that way. Let's see. In 2006, Chavez government began nationalizing several industries as part of its policy of wealth redistribution and reducing the influence of multinational corporations. As a result of these nationalizations, production of goods in Venezuela has dropped. So boo-hoo, you don't get your Xboxes, you don't get your PS4s, boo-hoo-hoo. At least you get food. At least all the wealth and all the oil, is staying in this country. It's not, he nationalized Venezuela's largest telephone companies and electric utilities. Because you see how the private sector completely fucking failed in the case of like Puerto Rico and Hurricane Maria. A big hurricane comes and hits Venezuela like that, and would a private sector electric grid, telephone companies really be able to, sustain that grid? They nationalized steel. They, yeah, nationalized banks over the course of the Venezuelan banking crisis of 2009 to 10. So, in other words, uh, one of Chavez's administration's primary goals was to reduce the entrance of foreign capitalists in Venezuela. As part of his overall push towards a localized economic democratization, towards this aim, it strongly promoted various forms of Latin America economic and political integration, such as regional currencies, uh, sucre, somewhat analogous to the euro, regional credit slash financial institutions such as Bancosur to remove dependence on the IMF slash World Bank and trade pacts such as Alba, Petrosur, and bartering oil for doctors with Cuba. Which, of course, we all know Cuba is the biggest supplier of doctors abroad in the world. Go Cuba. Um, the Sucre system is part of a virtual currency system used mainly by Venezuela and Ecuador. There is some risks such as money laundering and fraud, however, it's been seen as beneficial for trade since Ecuador uses the United States dollar as its national currency, and Venezuela's strict currency controls have created a US dollar shortage in Venezuela. So, all that said, Venezuela is not a threat to the United States. The Bolivarian Revolution, if anything, represents a liberation for the people of Venezuela and resistance against the imperialist policies of the US. The fact that David doesn't support them but instead chastises them is very, very telling. Uh, and it's very telling of how shallow social democracy really is as a philosophy, and how it ultimately betrays the working class and the socialist revolution when it comes down to the nitty gritty. So in part 2, we'll explore more on this video of David Pakman. I kind of veered off topic, started getting into Venezuela, but he was the one that brought it up. He was the one that went there, and I felt the need to speak up on behalf of Venezuela. I am not one of these morons that say that we need to support Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido is just a bum, ladies and gentlemen. He's just a chud who wants to call himself president. Nothing more, nothing less. So, viva la Venezuela, viva la Chavista Revolution, and viva la Nicolas Maduro.